I'm Jenn White, and this is a special live taping of 1A from the Phillips Academy in Birmingham, Alabama. From dawn till dusk on Tuesday, many of Alabama's schools, libraries, and town halls had traffic rushing through them. Almost 800,000 Alabamians voted in this year's federal primaries. That's according to Alabama's Secretary of State's office. Many other states across the country saw a similar rush due to people casting their votes in the primary election. But this year, Alabama looks a little different. This election uses a congressional district map that gives more power back to black voters in Alabama. The state adopted the new maps in October after the Supreme Court ruled that the one used in the 2022 midterm elections were illegally gerrymandered. A court-appointed special master drew a newly shaped district, District 2 in southern Alabama, and District 2 brought out some competition, something Alabama doesn't see often in its elections. Both parties' primaries are going to a runoff next month to decide what the final November matchup might be. We're back in Birmingham as part of our Remaking America collaboration with 6 partner stations across the country, including WBHM. Remaking America looks at the state of our democracy and trust in our government. For today's conversation, in a democracy, why are competitive elections important? And how much power do voters have? With us here on stage is Tafeni English-Relf. She's the director of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Alabama State Office. Tafeni, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Also with us is Stephanie Butler. She's the treasurer of the Alabama League of Women Voters and a board member of the Greater Birmingham League. Stephanie, it's great to have you.
Glad to be here.
And Pete Jones. He's a professor of public administration at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. Pete, welcome.
Thank you.
And we want to hear from all of you. What do you think could make elections more competitive in the state? And how does the lack of competitive elections in Alabama make you think about the power of your vote? Text the word event to 877-454-9348 to talk to us tonight. That's 877-454-9348. So as I said, in October, federal judges approved one of 3 different maps creating Alabama's new district lines, and they were drawn by a court special master. Those new lines carve up some cities and counties that were previously all in one district. So District 2 includes Montgomery, Troy, Eufaula, Tuskegee, Greenville, Union Springs, and Evergreen. Tafeni, why is District 2 a more competitive district compared to other parts of the state?
Well, I really want to just say how once the Supreme Court ruled, we were really ecstatic. Being a native Alabamian, to have a 2nd congressional district drawn that would have representation for black residents of the 2nd congressional district was so important. It provides such another opportunity for their needs to be heard, not only statewide, but also at the national level as well. And so where we were packed into one district, having that 2nd district and additional representation again was key. The fact that the race was competitive was also very telling, right? It was very telling about Alabama. We know most of the time local elections, people are running unopposed, or there's not a lot of interest in running, or voters feel that they don't have choices that they can vote for. So to have the number of candidates in this race demonstrated to us, one, that there was an eagerness and a hunger to be the voice for the 2nd congressional district. So that's what I have at.
And who are the 4 candidates heading to a runoff?
So heading to the runoff on the Democratic side is Shamori Figures and Anthony Daniels, and on the Democratic side it is Dick Brubaker and Carol, I'm gonna forget her last name. Dobson. I always want to say her last name is Bennett. Don't ask me why, but it is Carol Dobson who's heading to the runoff for the Republican Party.
So because it's a more competitive district, how do you think that shaped the messaging that people in that district heard during this race?
So I think it shaped messaging in a couple of different ways. One, because we know we had individuals running who lived across the state, right? And so messaging really was tied to wanting to be the representation or the voice for the 2nd congressional district, because there had not been that voice. And so the messaging and what it would do for Alabamians was honed in on by the candidates. There were listening sessions that were had. But I think when we look at the turnout, right? The turnout also showed to us that people by far and large are, I don't want to use the word skeptical, but there's still reservation about, does representation matter?
Pete, how have Alabama's previous maps shaped the state's representation in Congress?
I mean, we've been 6-1, a Republican-dominated state for over a decade, and as you were pointing out, it really does turn off voters. I mean, it's, in a sense, those elections were so safe for the incumbents a lot of time that they really didn't have to engage voters in a way that you normally would in an election. You didn't really have to, distance yourself from another candidate at the primary. You also didn't really have to engage with your challenger all that much. And so I think to Tafeni's point, I mean, that really left a lot of voters just used to, well, it doesn't necessarily matter because we know we're going to send that same person back. And this was for both Democrats and Republicans. District 7 was a safe seat for Representative Congresswoman Sewell. It was a safe seat for the other districts too. And so I think really for kind of shaping Congress, we do get a lot of federal support. Aside from that, we didn't really think we had a huge voice or that it was really representative of those districts because, the incumbents were really going back if they wanted to.
And what about the way that representation in Congress reflected or didn't reflect the demographic makeup of the state?
Yeah, that was big. I mean, our state is comprised of 27% African Americans, and we, had one African American Congress representative. And so, primarily we were sending white representatives in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. And so it really, in terms of the racial makeup, which was what the maps were overturned for, not representative whatsoever, but also in terms of a whole host of other things, right? Predominantly male, predominantly from rural areas where we maybe had more growing in the metros with Huntsville and Mobile and some other places. And so really just across different aspects, we were leaving out a lot of voters, young voters, the Hispanic population, all kinds of different voters that really weren't being represented because we tend to send the same types of representatives to Congress every year.
Well, Stephanie, the Alabama Secretary of State says about 800,000 people showed up in the primary this year to vote. How does that compare to previous years?
I've been looking specifically at the turnout in the rural counties of District 2, and I was disappointed to see that turnout was down. In the reporting that I saw in Jefferson County, which is where I live, turnout was down. It was pretty much down all around the state, which is a little bit discouraging. And it's especially discouraging in District 2, where we're really hoping that the opportunity to vote for somebody who will represent the interests of African Americans will motivate people to vote. But we also have to accept that they haven't had that opportunity in their lifetimes and possibly even their parents' lifetimes. It's been a long time since they knew that they had an opportunity to speak their voice.
Yeah, Pete?
I'll say statewide, so in 2016 we were at a 41% turnout, big Republican field, right? This was when Trump was making his move. 2020, 33%. Again, we're a Republican-dominated state, so you're not going to have a bunch of people turn out when you've got an incumbent Republican with not many challengers. 20.5% across the state this year. So we're at half of what we were in 2016, which again, you would expect without a bunch of Republican challengers. But essentially, you've gotten half the voter turnout that you did in competitive years, where folks really had a choice in who was going to be their president. And so I think it's really telling that as we've kind of coalesced around the Republican Party essentially runs all three branches of government, and then they've really aligned with Trump in so many ways that voters, both sides, right, Republicans and Democrats, aren't coming out to vote because they don't think their choice really matters. They think it's going to be Trump, and why go vote? Why spend my Tuesday doing that?
Tafeni, it also makes me wonder, though, about those non-top of ticket races and how people feel about the power of their vote when it comes to something like city council or the clerk that's going to represent them in any given area. Do you see a connection there as well?
Definitely. I think that's been a connection, for the last decade. And one of the things that we're doing at Southern Poverty Law Center through a campaign of Beyond the Vote is really educating communities, specifically our young voters and voting age, about those roles and the impact that local elections have on opportunities for these communities. We look at specifically rural communities, and we're looking at a decline in population, right? We're looking at lack of jobs. We're looking at water crisis in most of our rural communities where there's not adequate drinking water. And we look at federal funding that's flowing into the state and the responsibility and the liaison of getting that money to the cities that they need. And we, talk about the number of natural disasters that are more frequent in nature in Alabama, and we look at urban communities, which on average it takes about 5 to 7 years for them to recover, and rural communities anywhere from 10 to 15. But if they're not getting those resources when there's not a natural disaster, can you imagine the challenge that it would be when they face that? And so what we're looking at with our Beyond the Vote campaign is really engaging and educating the community about the roles that local government play. And then, as we really think about increasing civic engagement across the board, that's also increasing those who are wanting to run for elected positions on the local level. And several of those positions in Alabama oftentimes go unopposed for years. I was just sharing with someone, I grew up in Talladega County in a small rural community, and it's been the same mayor since I was in middle school. He took a 4-year sabbatical, but he's back. He's the mayor now, and I graduated high school in 1992.
Me too.
Yeah, so, and that's the picture that is painted, and that's the picture also that our young people are seeing. So, even wanting to return home, the opportunity to do that, they choose to stay other places because there has not been that change at the local level.
We got this comment from Randy, who's here tonight, and Randy says, even in a new district, we see the power of quasi-incumbency because of name recognition. I mean, Stephanie, how much does name recognition, especially among the runoff candidates people have to choose from in District 2, what role do you think that might play?
Name recognition is definitely significant, but money also plays a significant role in the races. One of the candidates for District 2, Phyllis Harvey Hall, I think it was her third run, she has name recognition, but I just don't think that she had the resources to cover the district as much as the top candidates, Figures and Daniels. I just don't think that she had the financial resources.
Mm-hmm. So voters had 8 Republicans or 11 Democrats to choose from in District 2 in the primaries. Why do you think it's important that that new district had so many people raising their hand for this election? Pete, I want to hear from you first.
One, it was exciting to see so many people, but I think different reasons for different parties. On the Republican side, you really had a lot of folks who realized all eyes are going to be on District 2 come November. This is, in many ways, with the razor-thin margins in Congress, District 2 could decide some things in ways that Alabama has not mattered in quite a while. And so for the Republican side, it's a great opportunity to make a name and really move up into national politics. And I know the candidates are not going to say that. They're going to say, they're there for the people and to represent them, but it really is a great opportunity. For Democrats, because the state has been Republican controlled for so long, there are not many opportunities like this that come along. If you're a popular mayor, if you are well liked in the state house, to move up, you basically had District 7 before the map was overturned. And so now you've got twice as many opportunities, but it's still only 2. And so you've got all of those people who had been in politics for so long, this was finally their chance, and they weren't going to. I don't think they were going to miss it.
Yeah, Tafeni, anything to add?
No, he covered it.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear from you, Stephanie. You said you work a lot in rural districts, and that's where your focus is right now in rural areas. What do you hear from voters there about how they think about the competitiveness of these races? and the possibilities of competitiveness in District 2?
We hear that they're just not used to being spoken to at all. They are completely disregarded. If you look at the numbers for turnout, it's in the few hundred. I mean, some of these counties in the primary didn't even break 1,000 voters. So it's very, very hard to reach these voters. When you talk about having boots on the ground in Clark County or Butler County, you have to drive. I mean, you can hit a handful of people in the center of town, but then you have to drive and you have to get out into the sticks and you have to go knock on doors, and it might be miles between this house and the next one. It is very, very difficult to touch these voters. So that's what you hear, is that they're not spoken to at all. And it's a really big challenge.
I'm curious to hear from each of you, because you all live, and well, Pete and Stephanie, you live and vote here in Alabama. How are you feeling about the power of your vote at every level? At the local level, at the state level, at the national level? How are you feeling about that right now? Stephanie?
Well, in Alabama, the issues that we're facing right now in Alabama that are making the news, with IVF made national news, DEI is a big issue in the state. These are bills that are moving through our state legislature, banning books. All of those things happen at the state level, and I think that we need to make sure that all the voters understand that. Everybody's so focused on this congressional race, or they're focused on the race for president. That's not where all of this is happening. It's happening in Montgomery, and we need to make sure that people are educated about those candidates and those races. I feel like my vote really matters in Alabama. We have a supermajority in the state house and in the entire legislature. We really have to start to turn that down a little bit, because it's very difficult. It's very difficult to be facing an uphill battle all the time.
What about for you, Pete?
And so I have a little bit of a different perspective, and I probably shouldn't admit this because my students may hear it, but the day of the election, I really struggled to make time to go vote. And I have young kids, and so it's important for me to instill that in them. And voting is super important. And as I was looking at my schedule that day, it's something that I just was like, okay, when can I get there? And all of a sudden it was like, I just didn't have the urge, because candidly, not a lot of races in Birmingham were contested. So not that my vote didn't matter, legitimately it did not matter, because that person was going to win because they weren't running against anybody. And then statewide, right, it's not very competitive races. Same thing presidential. And so as I was thinking about my vote, it was, I felt such guilt thinking how the time that I have to take that for something that's really not going to matter. Ultimately, I went and voted, because that is, something that I consider a privilege to do. But it was for someone who teaches this, who lives it, who encourages the students, who encourages anybody who will listen to me. I was really struggling this year, because none of it really was going to tip the needle one way or the other.
But you're talking to young people often, and some of them are probably from Alabama, voting for Alabama maybe for the first time as a college student. How are you having these conversations with them, and what are they saying to you about how they feel about the political system and their engagement in it?
That's a big question, and I don't want to speak for all students. I obviously teach in a political science program, and so there's a selection bias there. I do teach in a science policy class, so I get some political junkies. A lot of them are disillusioned. It's the same thing that, they're going to hold their nose and vote. Their vote really doesn't matter in Alabama. But I think, to Tafeni's earlier statement, I think they're starting to understand that it isn't one election that moves the path, right? It's this election, and then this person got some support that they didn't think they were going to get, and all of a sudden they're going to run that next time. And they may fall in love with another candidate, and that they're going to go support that candidate. And so for a lot of them, I think, regardless of party, that's been my kind of push to them is, you're going to be voting for the rest of your life. And so start now, make it a commitment, and you don't know what's going to happen. You can support people and, encourage them, and maybe they don't win this time, maybe it doesn't look great this time, or maybe it doesn't matter this time, but ultimately it will if you keep at it.
Hey, Tafeni, take a step back for us and help us understand the mechanisms that made so many races in Alabama uncompetitive?
So I think it goes back to historically who has always maintained power and control in Alabama. As I said, I grew up same mayor, same representative. Like, I heard the name, it was a household name, right? And oftentimes in conversations, I know when I was a voting age, I started asking questions of my family members. I was like, well, why do you keep voting for this person? Like, what are they doing? I don't see the impact. I don't see the change. Very curious. And the notion was, well, I mean, they're not going to do anything anyway for us. And so I think when you hear that in conversation that passes from generation to generation, specifically in a place like Alabama, I recently relocated from Montgomery and moved to the northern part of the state. And one of the things that I said to my husband when we moved, I said, oh my goodness, who am I going to vote for? Like, that was the first thing on my mind. It was so important to me that we relocated to a place where I felt confident that I was voting for someone who represented me, who was aligned with my voice and my values, and also with my daughter returning home from Boston. I wanted her to be inspired when we went to the polls, and I was excited that she came over to vote with me, but she was like, all right, let's go do this thing. Like, she was not energetic about it at all, but to Pete's point, they are getting it, and what's important to them are the issues, right? They're not concerned about the level of division and the polarization from parties. Our young people are really concerned about critical issues, and they want to maintain, they want to be home. They want to contribute to Alabama. They want to be leaders in Alabama, but they also want an Alabama that will represent them and their voice and their values. And we're not seeing that, especially with, to your point, what's happened at the State House in the last couple of weeks. It literally took my breath away the first week, seeing the number of bills that were further suppressing Alabamians who contribute to this state. And so I think we really have to, really look at this holistically and not from a linear standpoint, and really think about the future of Alabama that we want to see.
Can I jump in real quick? Tafeni is right, and what is striking to me in talking to students, culture wars don't resonate with them. It is the critical issues, and I've thought a lot about this, and I've tried to figure it out, and part of me thinks they went through the pandemic, and they saw the adults arguing about all kinds of things, but they saw their classmates struggling, or they were struggling themselves, and so we're finally getting those folks into the electorate, and they're looking around going, why are they fighting over what books I get to read when I've struggled to be able to read by third grade, or my little brother is doing this in school, or we're struggling with poverty, or whatever it is. And it's so striking to me just how the difference between generations, the things that matter. Yeah, Tafeni's 100% right. The culture war stuff doesn't resonate with them. Like, they want to get down to, why are we doing this? Let's get down to business and do some things.
And I don't feel comfortable blaming it all on the voters either. In Alabama, we have some real systems issues. And I'm not sure if it's which one's the chicken, which one's the egg, but between gerrymandering and a failure of political vibrancy, we just don't have competition in a lot of places. With IVF being such a popular issue, I think it's important for people to know that we currently have 5 seats that are coming up for re-election. That's 5 of the 9. The only place where there is competition is for the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. There will be 1 Republican and 1 Democrat running. In the other 4 seats, not a single one of them is going to be decided in the general election. They've already been decided. Place 1, it was an uncontested Republican candidate, no Democrat, and place 2, 3, and 4, the incumbents ran unchallenged. So that's just a failure of political vibrancy. And if people care about that issue, they have no motivation. This election didn't motivate them to show up and vote because they can't make a difference on that issue.
But like you said, it's a chicken or egg question. Is it the system not working for people that leads to the political vibrancy, Or is there a loss of political vibrancy that allows systems that don't work to stay intact? And Tafeni, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think it's a combination of both, right? And it also goes back to education and who can run, right? Who can run for office? What does that look like? And we don't do enough of educating around that. Oftentimes when we see politicians, it is they're coming around to get the vote and they're going to tell you what they can do for you, right? No one is mentoring others to come up in this political arena, right? And then when you've lived in an area where there has not been substantial change and a reflection or representation of all, when you have a generation or two, right, who does not feel represented, who feels powerless, they're not going to want to sit in a seat that they have watched for decades and decades and decades not serve the people, right? And so that is where a lot of the education comes in. This is what your county commissioner's role is. This is the power that they possess. This is what you could actually change in your community, right? This is what your city council, even down to the boards, right? We were talking about the banning of books. Who's sitting on your local board at the public library? Who's sitting on the board of the electric commission? Who's sitting on the water board, right? We're seeing in Alabama where a lot of the water boards are being privatized. And we're also doing some of this work at Southern Poverty Law Center, but they're being privatized, and citizens who can't even make a livable wage are receiving water bills that are $200 and $300. Some to the like it's astronomical. And then looking at all of those factors and being educated on if you were in this position or if you turned out to vote to flip the seat, to run against someone who's unopposed, that in itself is power. And it's power that we have to re-educate, educate, and let the community know that they have this power.
Well, you have power tonight, too, to add your voice to this conversation, and we'd love for you to add your voice. You can send us a text to the word event at 877-454-9348 to join the conversation. We want to know how you think about voting in primary elections where you live as compared to the general election, and also how you're feeling about the power of your vote. And then at any point tonight, when you text us your first name, your question or comment, please also share whether you want me to read your text or you want to share your thoughts on mic. I strongly encourage you to come to the mic so we can have your voice as part of the conversation. Charles is here tonight, and Charles says, first past the post voting schemes seem to be a huge reason that we don't have competition in elections. Do any of the panelists find any interest within our state for alternative voting methods, such as Maine's ranked choice ballot system, either within primary or general elections? And just to note, first past the post voting is a system where voters cast a vote for a single candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins the election. Pete, I'll come to you first.
I'll start with that. I saw an interesting conversation with not our Secretary of State, but the Kentucky Secretary of State. And he made an interesting point that as you're thinking about the way you vote for people or your state election systems, it should reflect the people. There are states that have mail-in ballots, and if you're a state that isn't used to that, all of a sudden doing that the next election is really going to freak people out. And so in many ways he made the case that you have to kind of move one step at a time. So I don't know a ton of people who are clamoring for the ranked voting. I mean, obviously it does encourage coalitions, it does encourage different types of candidates. But to the question, I don't see it happening anytime soon, because I don't know that the state could jump to that in any ways. And I worry that our voters it would almost be too much of a jump.
Stephanie, your thoughts?
I don't mean to sound defeatist, but in Alabama, we don't have the same kinds of choices that people do in other states. A lot of people have citizens' initiatives to force amendments onto the ballot. We don't have that option in Alabama. So unless we can lobby our legislature for any kind of change, it's not coming. So we have to continue to build power.
I want to welcome Todd to the microphone. If you can make your way down to one of the mics. And you have a question about voting, go ahead, please.
Good evening. I now actually have a two-part question based on what you just said. My first question was, it's more of a statement than a question, honestly, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. If a state like Alabama actually cared and wanted people to vote, would we not make it easier as a fundamental start? Whether when people sign up for a driver's license, you're pre-enrolled, and it's a de facto statement. I think the question that y'all asked previously about, is it a chicken or egg, is maybe not the right question, because if fundamentally everyone doesn't have access to vote, isn't the chicken and egg question almost a secondary concern? And the other question I wanted to ask you directly, Jen, are other states as semi-defeatist and beaten down as we seem to be tonight? I mean, it's just the tone. It's just the tone is kind of remarkable, and I think y'all are speaking from the heart and the truth. Thank you.
So I want to, in case people weren't able to hear, Todd's first question was, if a state like Alabama truly wanted all citizens to vote, would state officials not pre-enroll Alabamians while they were, like, for instance, registering for their driver's license, essentially ensuring that everyone is registered? So let's start there. Tafeni?
It would be ideal. It really would be ideal. And I think, as we look at what's happened in Alabama, starting with the Shelby v. Holder case, right, that basically gutted voting rights here in Alabama. And then now here we are, fast forward 2024, and we're still creating barriers for individuals to get out to vote. Right now, SB 1, it has passed the Senate, which actually will make it a felony if you assist someone with an absentee ballot and they want to, give their niece or nephew, or, well, they say they won't penalize those people, but so the next of kin down the line. And so you're looking at you're looking at a felony, whether it's B or C, you're looking at a felony. And so Alabama continues to show that voters don't matter, at least not all voters matter. And so they make it very difficult for individuals to vote. We know years ago they had the whole ID thing. Now, college students aren't able to use college IDs. I mean, and the list just goes on and on. And what we're aiming to do is to continue being on the ground, mobilizing and organizing, even though that they continue to create those barriers. Because again, it's the education, and it's also giving people hope that their vote really is going to matter. Going back to the 2nd Congressional District, they have over 500,000 people who are registered to vote, who actually can vote. And you heard the turnout. It was very low. And so the question we have to ask ourselves again is why? With this being such an opportunity for Alabama, what is still prompting people to feel that Alabama doesn't care for Alabamians?
And then I think, and I hope I'm remembering the second part of your question correctly, Todd, but it was about whether the chicken and egg, about whether it's systems or political engagement, whether that question really matters if this issue of access to the vote is such a big problem. Stephanie?
Well, my comment about chicken and egg was really about whether it's engagement or gerrymandering. We've got a great advocacy team at the League of Women Voters, and I was asking them to give me some specific examples of gerrymandering. And one of the ones they pointed out is that the campus of Alabama A&M up in Huntsville is split to where the residential areas of campus are pulled east into a rural district. So they don't vote with the rest of campus. They don't vote with the city of Montgomery. The students on campus vote with a rural, largely white, largely Republican district. What is their motivation to turn out? So that was really my question, is whether it's the vibrancy of the electorate or it's the gerrymandering that tells people it doesn't matter if you turn out or not, you don't really have a voice.
And then Todd, your question to me was whether or not this feeling of defeat is reflected across the country. And the short answer is yes, but with some caveats. What I'm noticing this election season is a deep feeling of disenchantment with the political system, especially among young voters, first-time voters. young people for whom this would be their first presidential election. And a lot of questions about the system and the way it works at every level of government, because they recognize that they don't have candidates to choose from who reflect their values, their views around policy, and believe it or not, they have a lot of views about policy. And so I'm seeing it more generationally. At the same time, we did a show earlier this week after Super Tuesday, and we took live calls, and we got a call from a woman in, I forget which state it was now, but a woman from one state and a man, if I remember correctly, who was in Florida. And one was a Democrat, one was a Republican, and they said the same thing. I feel like my vote doesn't count because I live in a red bubble or a blue bubble. And so what I'm noticing more broadly is this feeling that the two-party system, more broadly, isn't working for people. Now, the other sort of bright spot that I've been thinking a lot about is Michigan, my home state, where a few years ago, a woman was very disenchanted with the way maps were drawn in the state. And she started asking questions and started this push to have an amendment added to a ballot initiative rather, added to the ballot to basically place the redistricting process in the hands of the citizens rather than in the hands of the legislature. And the ballot initiative passed. And in the last election, the legislature, which had been under Republican control for about 30 years, flipped for the first time in decades. And so I look at something like that, not because of the outcome of the election, but just because of the power the voters took into their own hands. Now, I know, Pete, here in Alabama, that sort of thing isn't necessarily possible, but where do you see places where voters maybe have more power than they may recognize?
Well, I think it goes back to what you were talking about earlier and Tafeni and Stephanie made really important comments. And I'm so glad you asked this question because I finally get to talk about like poll workers and local elections and how that matters. And I think it matters at local elections, and essentially Alabama, our political leaders will want that to happen, will want to automatically register people when turnout matters. Right now it doesn't. One party state, it doesn't matter if 5 people show up because we know that that candidate is going to win. They're going to win 4-1 instead of 400,000 to 100, whatever it might be. And so once turnout matters, and it's going to start mattering in District 2, it's going to matter in a lot of local elections, that's when they're going to say, okay, we want to get more voters out, both Republicans and Democrats, because turnout matters, and then they're going to start investing in those systems. It is a very, very difficult thing, though, as someone who's pushing for different policies to say, we want you all to invest in good infrastructure to, make sure the rolls are up to date. And we want you to pay poll workers more because there's an aging poll worker workforce that we're not getting folks out to work the polls. And those are things that as citizens, we don't really ever ask them to do. We don't know how much a poll worker, the average citizen probably doesn't know how much you get for working the polls for 12 hours. But if you up that and all of a sudden you make your infrastructure better where your driver's license systems are automatic, like all of those things take resources. We are pushing for that because that's more resources that go to that instead of something else. And the politicians aren't pushing for it because why should they? They're fine with the 21 or 20.5% of people that showed up. So I think those two things have to happen. We have to really show them that turnout matters. And again, District 2 is going to help with that. Local elections are going to help with that. But we also have to start, really speaking to the value of good government. Not big government, small government, but just whatever size, just good government. That you should have automatic updates to your roles with good software and good infrastructure systems, secure systems, right? All of those things that matter, that are nonpartisan, apolitical, like we want secure systems that everybody can go vote and do. So I think those two things are the kind of the things that I would hope to see.
I want to invite Rashmi to the microphone. And while you're making your way down, it occurs to me, the last time 1A was here in Birmingham, it was right around the anniversary of the Children's Crusade. And whenever I come to this city, I'm struck by the feeling of history and the hard-won battles fought in this state to give people access to things like the vote. And Tafeni, when you're out and you are working to engage voters, how does that history weigh in your mind?
For me, it weighs very heavy, especially growing up so close to the movement and the history of the movement. As I said, I grew up right down I-20, so you know, the history of Shuttlesworth and the Children's Crusade is my grounding. It is part of my why. And because I also have family members with lived experiences in the movement. And so that motivates me, and sharing that specifically with young people in a very different way, right? It's more about the collective collaboration of movement building that grounds them, right? And to have an appreciation for the sacrifices motivates me to do this work, but it also helps me to see the work through a different lens, through different perspectives, and understanding to, like I said, I have a 24-year-old, right, who watched me in this line of work because I've been doing civil rights work for over 25 years. And the question she had for me, her first time voting, she really was just like, how does this happen, Mom? Like, even with all of the history and the grounding that she grew up with, and now her question, you know, it's more of a comment. I hear you, I appreciate it, but make that relevant to me and what I can do in this moment. And so the work that we're doing to really mobilize young people is also to show them how historically movements have happened, and it has happened with young people across the line, intergenerational. We look at SNCC, right? We look at all of those, and we look at the Julian Bonds and the Ella Bakers of the movement and their voice. And so encouraging young people to lift up those issues and to be a loud voice, because their voice matters. Because they're voting, they're a voting age. Yeah.
Rashmi, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. As the civic engagement liaison for a local mosque, I personally believe it's important for various groups to robustly and civilly engage with all elected officials, especially Republicans, given the reality of our state. Most recently, in light of the catastrophic events in Palestine and Israel, the American Muslim community has demonstrated increased civic engagement, such as phone banking to elected officials, scheduling constituent meetings, and the uncommitted movement in both Michigan and Minnesota. Locally in the Birmingham metro area, we are looking to build foundational and friendly relationships with our representatives, so at a minimum they know who we are and the various ways we're serving our great state of Alabama. Even though it's unlikely that our representatives will change their official position on a given issue, we are hopeful, God willing, that in due course there will be increased nuance and thoughtfulness in their positions as a result of our relationship building efforts. Thank you for the opportunity.
Rashmi, thanks. I mean, that raises this question about the types of work you're doing, Tafeni and Stephanie, and at the grassroots level, how are you working together to accomplish some of your goals, if you are?
No, what you just said, thank you for that, is the bottom line. It is about building relationships. These candidates are going to come in, they're going to hit hard, and after the election, they're going to be gone. It's up to the League of Women Voters, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the ACLU, the NAACP. It's up to all of us to stay consistent, stay on the ground, not just at election time. We have to remind them constantly that their vote matters in their municipal elections. I mean, we were asking Pete earlier about voting in the smaller elections. Some of these municipalities, there might be a couple thousand people registered and a few hundred who show up. It's very easy to make a difference in that election, but nobody's talking to these very small communities. And I think if we start talking to these kids and giving them the data. These are smart young folks that we're dealing with here. If we start giving them the data and say, hey, get your whole neighborhood to show up, get your, you graduated last year, call your senior class, get everybody to register, get them there. A couple dozen votes can make a difference. They can make the choice. We just had such a fabulous week engaging with the youth. This past weekend was the 59th Jubilee in Selma, the anniversary of the bridge crossing. And the League of Women Voters partnered with the NAACP, and we had hundreds of students came in from around the state for our program. They were college students, and some of them were high school students. And by and large, the 3 hours was driven and led by the students. We gave them 3-4 minutes at a time and just up and down, up and down, up and down to speak their piece, speak their mind, tell us what they were thinking, tell us about how they're building power among their peers, on their campuses, with their friends. They're doing really incredible work, but we can't drop the ball and leave them behind after this election. It's our job, the civic engagement organizations, to keep at it.
I mean, part of what I'm hearing from all of you is that the work of building engagement and educating people about the options they do have and what power their vote does hold. It's not a one-time thing. We're talking a long-term, incremental process that has to be consistent, and it can't just be in a presidential election year. It has to be around every election, every local office that's up for grabs. That conversation has to be ongoing.
Yeah, and it also has to be around the issues that are important to them. To your point, we had an amazing weekend. The League of Women Voters and the NAACP bused number of students, and then there was Alabama Forward, Transform Alabama, and SPLC, who also had another event where we bused students on Saturday and engaged with them through the arts. And so it is, again, speaking to their issues and what it is that's important to them and building that relationship. And I think too, we're talking about mobilizing and engagement around voting, but it's more than that. It's also about the issues that are important to them. We've done a couple of focus groups at SPLC with young folks and listened to some of the issues that are important to them, right? Housing, affordable housing is important to them, right? Access to adequate health care, specifically here in Alabama, the expansion of Medicaid is important to young folks. Quality education, K through 12 and access, that's important to them. And so those are some key issues that are really important to our young people. And so again, engaging and mobilizing around those issues and giving voice to those issues and how they elevate that at their local level.
Did you want to jump in?
Well, I think too, the relationship building is such a key thing. So I'm glad you brought this up. And to your point, anybody, like politicians, students, anybody that we're talking about, it is that kind of consistent engagement and the two-way conversation. Just as much as voters can't stand a politician, coming in and asking for a vote and then leaving, they're also just as suspect about organizations coming in and saying, hey, election's coming up, we need you to volunteer, don't forget how important your vote is, and then they're out the door and they didn't ask what their needs were, what their issues were. And so I've been struck just about how, across the state, everyone in the policy space is starting to recognize, we've got to be in touch with the voters, we've got to be in touch with the people consistently, not just every November, but we need to understand them a little bit better just to show that we're here. And that's for politicians and the advocacy space too. So a credit to Stephanie and Tafeni's organizations, because I do think they are really getting out into the communities and keeping that kind of those touch points consistently. But it's interesting you're talking about relationship building, because those work for voters, they work for politicians, just really anybody.
I want to welcome Jordan to the microphone. And Jordan, while you're making your way down, I want to get to this question from Carlissa, who says, in the past, the newspaper would send the candidates pictures, party representation, and bios out with sample ballots. Is it possible that the end of the physical newspaper and how social media uses algorithms to market to people, that all generations missed out on getting actionable information? And there's a whole other conversation there we could have about the loss of local newsrooms and how that kind of legislative coverage has contracted over the years. But Pete, I want to come to you first on that.
Yeah, that's another big question. And it's interesting to me because I think our focus is on young voters when we think about how they, the changing world of their information, but I think they in many ways understand better than other generations how to navigate, a fake Facebook post or a fake X post. And so I do think in many ways as our voting population ages, especially in Alabama, the kind of decline of local news is really, really making them susceptible to a lot of these things.
And I just want to mention that there's a lot of people my age and older who are on Facebook and just as exposed to the powers of the algorithm as the young people are.
And I'm hoping that sector is responding. I mean, we've got some great journalists in the state. I mean, we have really an embarrassment of riches of great journalists. I'm sure you know many of them, but so a nod to them. But in many ways, they too understand that it's the boring, public budget meeting that you can go to that's going to uncover the story. I mean, you're probably aware that everyone in here is aware of the Brookside report, right? Where the Brookside community was over-policing, half their town's budget was fines and fees, right? That started as just a journalist digging into a boring budget. And so I think that the pieces are still there. It's really trying to figure out how that community responds to bring the news to them in a reliable way.
Hi, Jordan, go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, my mind just blinked. So I'm one of those young voters. This will be my third presidential election. And I do feel very disconnected from a lot of the candidates, both local and also all the way up on the national level. And even with the presidential election, as you all were saying earlier, there's a lack of competition between the two parties. I see Joe Biden and Donald Trump as very similar candidates, and neither of them appeal to me and what I want. But also, since you mentioned being here last year with the the anniversary of the 1963 Children's March, last year was also the 60th anniversary of the Birmingham, the 16th Street church bombing, and NPR did an article interviewing Lisa McNair, who was the younger sister born several years later of Denise McNair. And in that article, she talks about how much hasn't changed since the 1960s and how disappointed she was in that. And I see this as something that I related to as well. But I try to stay hopeful, and one of the ways I find it is focusing on what Ruha Benjamin says in her book Viral Justice. She emphasizes this idea that she's the self-identified macro-sociologist, so she always focused on the big picture until she realized that's not going to work, and she, inspired by the COVID-19 pandemic, takes inspiration that something so micro, so minuscule, can have such a change on the world, and that change is both negative and positive, while also being neither negative or positive. And we have to start within ourselves. And so for me, being a young voter, I focus more on what I can do on an individual level, what I can do within my community, and the changes I can make, the positive changes I can make outside of the polls, since I don't feel represented on the ballot.
Thank you for that comment. Thank you for that comment. Stephanie, this may seem like an odd segue, but I think it's an important one, because part of the feeling of disempowerment I hear from people so much around our political system is a lack of transparency about what's happening in the houses of state legislatures, in Congress. How much visibility does the public here in Alabama have to the deliberations that state and local legislators in the state are having around how they do their work and what work is getting done?
So until recently, not much. And this actually kind of ties into what the young lady was just talking about. How to make change. A lot of times it's change you don't see. It's incremental, it's small, it is a change of tone, it is a change of phrasing, it is seeing a bill come back tweaked year after year for the better or for the worse. That's what change looks like. It's not often that it's all at once. And we have created a significant we've made a significant impact on transparency in Alabama at the league by the creation of the Alabama channel. You don't have to go and sit in Montgomery and sit through hours-long legislative sessions or committee meetings anymore. You can watch it from your home. You know, that's a huge barrier to people who want to be involved and informed, is they can't get to Montgomery. You can't take a day off in the middle of the week to find out what's really going on in the State House. You can hear everything that's going on now. The legislature, before the Alabama channel, was live streaming some of their content, but none of it was saved. So once it went out live, it was gone. Now we capture everything that comes out of the State House. It's stored, it's labeled, everything is searchable, and anything that's important to the voters, if it's not in a room that's being live streamed by the Capitol, we get a camera in the room and we make sure that there are eyes in the room. We like to get there a few minutes early to hear the chatter that's going on, because sometimes the official word is not always the most important thing in the room. So anything that you want to know about that's going on at the State House, the Senate, or the House, go to the alabamachannel.com. You can go in there and just search something that you're interested in. If you're interested in DEI, put DEI in the search bar and it'll bring up every conversation that's been had, and you can just go to the timestamp. Instead of watching 5 hours of a session, you can just go to those little bits. It's fantastic.
And that's the kind of information that can possibly guide some of that micro work that you're talking about. I want to get to this from Donna, who's here tonight. Donna says, in Alabama, there are many restrictions on who can vote. Some convicted felons never lost their right to vote, and others can apply to restore their voting rights after they've served their time, but the state does not make this known to the public. Also, a bill has already passed the state Senate, which will criminalize anyone except a close relative who assists someone, including disabled persons, with an absentee ballot. And that's something you mentioned earlier, Tafeni. How aware are voters about what they need to do to ensure all their information is up to date for the elections this year, especially with the change in districts?
Yeah, so I think messaging and communications channels from some of the advocacy organizations will be key. I think there was one mass newspaper blast with all of, when we talked about the moral turpitude and those who had the ability to get their rights restored. That was not enough, right? But the state of Alabama was just like, look, this is our obligation, and they did the bare minimum. And so what our organizations, civic organizations like Southern Poverty Law Center, there are others like Rolling to the Polls, Alabama Forward, League of Women Voters, Greater Birmingham Ministries is really key in this, and they actually work on the ground to ensure that individuals know the process for restoring their right to vote, and if you actually had your right taken away from you. Because a lot of times people just think, oh, I have a criminal record, I can't vote, and that's not true. So again, back to that civic engagement and really meeting communities where they are is key.
I want to wrap with a comment one of you sent, but first, really quickly, Pete, the presidential race, of course, is at the top of the ballot. That's going to capture a lot of attention in November. But what other things should Alabamians pay attention to on their ballot this year?
I mean, District 2 is going to be, I think, where all the focus is. Our state tends to put amendments on there, so we'll see if there are any that make the ballot. And then otherwise, I would just point to the conversations we've had. It's the local elections. Again, I think that's where a lot of things are going to change, or if you're wanting to make some change, that's where you can do it. And so, just looking at what's happening in your county or your city, that to me is where the eyes are going to be. Aside from District 2, because that's where everybody's really going to care about it.
Well, I want to wrap on this comment we got from Lizzie. Lizzie texted, as a native Alabamian, I feel dismayed and angry by the increasing creep towards the creation of a Christian nationalist state where the suppression of personal autonomy, choice, and even history is enacted through benighted laws. There is now an assumption that everyone is a Trumper, at least where I live. So on one hand, I want to leave this state. However, there are wonderful and decent folks here trying to make a difference. So on the other hand, I don't want to give up on this state. It's a beautiful place in so many ways, and I want more people to move here and change this direction. How can we encourage people to come here and make real change? Stephanie?
Just remember that Alabama really is beautiful, and it is absolutely worth fighting for. There's so many people here who deserve representation, who deserve to have their voices heard, who deserve to have the issues that they care about. working for them. It's a really wonderful place, and I'll fight somebody over it.
And Tafeni, I'll give you the last word here. You mentioned you have a daughter who recently came back from Boston, and I'm sure you've had these conversations about whether she stays, so this is personal.
So I would love for her to stay. I stayed for the very reason that I believed Alabama was worth fighting for. I've traveled this country with SPLC, and oftentimes people are just like, why are you still there? And I firmly believe that Alabama is worth fighting for. It was a place that my grandmother tilled her hands in the ground. My grandmother raised 13 children after her husband died, and it is that resilience that I have, and it is that hope that I have when I think about Alabama and who I'm fighting for. And plus, I want her to stay here. I want her to stay close by, and she's talented, and I want her to use her talents for her home state.
All right, we will leave the conversation there. Pete, Stephanie, Tafeni, thank you so much for engaging in this conversation with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you all.